In this lecture, we are talking about women in medieval and Reformation Christianity, how women are viewed, and how women express themselves, particularly in mysticism. And we begin with a female mystic by the name of Julian of Norwich, who lived in the 14th, early 15th century. Very little is actually known about Julian, except that she was an anchorite. That is, a religious hermit and a recluse. And when Julian was about 30 years old, she was stricken with a serious illness. And thinking her near death, her parish priest came to administer the last rites. And as he held the crucifix in the air above her bed, Julian felt numb in her body. She felt her sight failing. And yet she did see something. She saw the figure of Jesus on the crucifix start to bleed. And over a period of about 11 hours, she had 16 separate visions of Christ. Now, she recovered from her illness within days, and she immediately wrote down a record of her visions. She probably came from a prominent family because she was educated and could write, and she also had quite a bit of knowledge of theology. And this is, in fact, the earliest surviving book written by a woman in the English language, Middle English to be precise. And she later expands it into a longer book called The Showings or Revelations of Divine Love. And throughout the 16 visions, a common theme that recurs is this problem of evil, the problem of suffering. And in this book, Julian demonstrates that she was already quite well read in matters of theology. She's pretty bright. And the main message in these visions is that God holds us and God keeps us through times of pain and times of joy. And her most famous line is, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Now, if you remember, we reviewed two kinds of mysticism. One where people can be united to God and become one with God because the soul is naturally divine. There's a spark of divinity, of godness in the soul. It's a kind of substantive or essential union with God. Meister Eckhart had that kind of view, and it was condemned as heretical, fortunately, after he was dead. And another kind of union with God, a different kind, is one where a person's will is joined to God's will. It's an acquired union with God. And that one can be more easily reconciled with Christian teaching. Well, Julian actually has definite tendencies in the first direction, the dangerous direction. She talks about becoming substantially one with God, and she looks forward to the time when there will be no created thing between her and God. That is, she has a mysticism that wants to escape the creaturely. We heard a little bit of that in Meister Eckhart. So the soul is like God in nature and in substance, she says. On the other hand, I said she was pretty bright. She also makes statements that are more orthodox and guarded, where she will talk about a union of the human will with God's will. So Julian leans toward Eckhart, I think, but she doesn't want to get in trouble with the church. And so that might be why she repeatedly and very conspicuously keeps referring to Holy Mother Church. Now, one thing that's also conspicuous in Julian and other female mystics is the predominance of feminine imagery. And mysticism, if you remember, was one of those few acceptable outlets for religious expression that were available to women in medieval and early modern times. And so, like other mystics, Julian of Norwich speaks often of Christ as the groom with his bride. That's a very common theme, of course. It has biblical roots in Paul. But the identity of the bride is not always the church, as we find in the book of Ephesians, but rather the soul. And that's an interesting turn from the communal image of the church to the individual. It's very interesting. It's not only a modern thing, individualism. Mysticism tends to be individualistic as well. And what's more notable is her image of Christ as mother. Some people might find that very striking, even jarring at first, if you're not used to it. Now, of course, her imagery reflects gender roles in the late Middle Ages, which today we would consider to be stereotypical roles, stereotyped roles. So if Jesus is comforting and nurturing, that's a maternal, motherly image for Julian. But I think perhaps also it softens the cultural blow when she introduces feminine imagery into her description of the Trinity. If she describes these feminine aspects in traditional ways, maybe it will soften the blow for people. Now, she particularly associates this motherhood with the Son, with Jesus. But she also has passages where she seems to ascribe the attributes of motherhood to the whole Trinity. And this indicates that she knows an important theological principle, that the external works of the Trinity are undivided. The Latin term for that is opera trinitatis ad extra indivisa sunt. That is, the works of the Trinity that are external to the Trinity are undivided. But still, comments like this from Julian are likely to shock people today. She writes that God the Father willed that the second person of the Trinity, should become our mother. Our Father wills, our Mother works, our good Lord the Holy Spirit confirms. However, people in the Middle Ages who were learned in the Church Fathers would not be so shocked by this kind of language, because you find it, for example, in Clement of Alexandria. He writes that God became feminine out of love for us, his people. That is, he became compassionate. Again, you have the kind of female stereotype of being compassionate. Men, obviously, are not compassionate jerks. So to be feminine is to be compassionate, according to that stereotype. Now, jumping ahead to John Calvin, we see a similar move in his commentary on Isaiah. Calvin notes how God compares himself to a mother who goes through a terribly painful childbirth. You have to remember, in the 16th century, women often died in childbirth, and children often died. Yet the love of a mother for a child is beyond comparison, even though mothers go through that terrible childbirth. And Calvin notes there were no epidurals in the 16th century. And Calvin also notes that people might take offense at applying this feminine imagery to God. That's a reflection of his culture, but even today, people might do that. He defends, however, this feminine imagery in the Bible, and he continues to run with it in his commentary on Isaiah. On Isaiah 49:15, Calvin compares the anxiety or the care, concern that a mother has for her children to the Lord's anxiety and worrying about his people. A mother whose, quote, whose love toward her offspring is so strong and ardent as to leave a father's love far behind. Well, thanks a lot, Calvin. Anyway, thus he did not satisfy himself with proposing the example of a father, which on other occasions he very frequently employs, but in order to express his very strong affection, he chose to liken himself to a mother. What amazing affection does a mother feel toward her offspring, which she cherishes in her bosom, suckles on her breast, and watches over with tender care, so that she passes sleepless nights, wears herself out by continued anxiety, and forgets herself. And this carefulness is manifested not only among men, but even among savage beasts, which, though they are by nature cruel, yet in this respect are gentle. Think of a mother tiger or lion with her cubs, for example. Now, I want to go back a bit to Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Your reading of Aquinas included a section on women, which very likely you found very shocking. It can be very offensive to modern ears for good reason. Thomas's view of women, however, has been referenced very recently by popes defending a male-only priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church. And now, to try to understand this, we have to start with Thomas's view of ordination as a sacrament. For Thomas and for Roman Catholic theology, ordination leaves an indelible, that is, permanent mark on the person who is ordained. And in addition, without ordination, a person can go up there and say the words of the Mass, but then nothing happens. No transubstantiation happens. No grace will come through the sacrament. No forgiveness will take place by taking the sacrament. So the sacrament is totally invalid without the supernatural grace of ordination. Now remember that a sacrament consists of a sign and a thing that the sign signifies. The substance and the thing, the substance in ordination, is the priesthood of Christ. So what symbolizes the priesthood of Christ? And because you have to remember that Christian ministry is now in the Middle Ages conceived of in very Old Testament terms as the priest offering a sacrifice. The Mass is considered a sacrifice offered to God. So the substance is that priesthood of Christ, Christ offering himself, which the priest repeats and reoffers and represents. What is the sign of that priesthood? Well, the sign is resemblance to Christ, including resembling him in his masculinity, in his male gender. And this is still the argument of the Roman Catholic Church against women in ministry. And ironically, you'll find a very similar argument among some Protestants. For example, Jesus only chose men to be his disciples. Well, he also only chose Jewish people to be his disciples. So can only Jewish people be pastors? In any case, you also notice in the reading from Aquinas some strange views about female biology. And this comes from Aristotle. The most offensive part is that Aristotle argues that a female is a defective male. And, very unfortunately, Aquinas takes this view, which was considered utterly scientific, he takes it to be the truth. But you could tell he's a little bit uncomfortable with it. And if you remember when we talked way back about Aristotle's hylomorphism, that everything is composed of form and matter, well, Aristotle, who doesn't know a thing about the biology of human beings or reproduction, because nobody knows anything about that yet, he says that the male furnishes the spiritual form and that the female furnishes the matter, and that the form is superior to matter as the soul is superior to the body. Okay, now brace yourself. So when a conception goes wrong, you get various things that could happen. You get a spontaneous abortion, or you get a serious birth defect, or you get a female. This can happen because of a defect in the man if he's very young or very old, and apparently this was quite common when there was a south wind. This is the state of ancient and medieval science. And by the way, Plato, Aristotle's teacher, had a totally different view of women. He thought that women could be equal to men if they were given the same opportunity and education. Women could even be like the male philosopher kings in the Republic. You could have a woman being a philosopher queen in Plato's Republic. But Aristotle, his views prevailed. And when Aquinas synthesizes Aristotelian science, so to speak, with his theology of ordination, this is what you get. So for Thomas, the female does not represent the pinnacle of excellence, but is rather in the status of submission. This continues even in early modern times, you have this view. And thus, she cannot receive ordination. In the medieval view of ordination, you have to be perfect. You can't be a malformed individual and be a priest either. Other persons who cannot be ordained include people who have serious physical deformities, people who are morally deformed, like a criminal or a murderer. Slaves are in a position of subjection and cannot be ordained unless they are freed. They could be ordained. So slaves are potentially better off than women in this regard. Now, all of this is terribly offensive, of course, and based on a science which we would call foolishness. But I want you to notice that for Thomas, there is some ambiguity. There's some uncomfortableness that he has and tension in his own thought. And so Thomas says, prophecy is not a sacrament, but a gift of God. Wherefore, there it is not the sign, but only the thing which is necessary. And since in matters pertaining to the soul, woman does not differ from man as to the thing, for sometimes a woman is found to be better than many men as regards the soul. Because of that, it follows that she can receive the gift of prophecy and the like, but not the sacrament of orders, that is, ordination. And that's interesting because for Protestants, the ministry is not a priestly office, it's a prophetic office. Preaching is related to prophecy in the Reformation view. And Thomas, in that same article, by the way, says that women can, in fact, hold secular power. Not everybody agreed with that. A lot of the reformers thought that women really were not preferable. It's better to have a king than a queen. Thomas also makes exception for women as emergency ministers. So in the case of a newborn infant who's about to die, something that happened very commonly, a woman, usually a midwife, can administer the rite of baptism. Midwives were trained to do this. Of course, this is connected to that view of baptism as absolutely necessary for salvation. And in the Reformation, this changes a bit. The Reformed reject emergency baptism with the side effect that now women can do just about nothing in terms of Christian ministry, ever. While in the Lutheran tradition, they still have a similar view of the sacrament of baptism to the Roman Catholics. And so they continue that practice of emergency baptism. But neither tradition considers female pastors until around the 20th century. And today, it's still a controversial and dividing issue in many traditions that stem from the Reformation. In some traditions, it's considered a mark of faithfulness to Scripture. If you don't have women ministers, then you believe God and you believe the Bible. And if you do have women ministers, you must be a liberal and you don't take God at his word. That's how some people argue. Now, the perspective on the sacraments, including marriage being considered a sacrament, changes considerably in the time of the Reformation. I think changes much more for the better. And Luther teaches the priesthood of all believers. And the Reformers reject Roman Catholic teaching on marriage as a sacrament. And the Reformers praise the estate of marriage, and they show a new respect for married women, in contrast to the older view that a truly holy woman would dedicate herself to a convent and become a nun. And in fact, the Reformers reject the idea that celibacy is a higher, holier calling than marriage. A perspective, the older perspective, I think, was founded on ancient views of the inferiority of women and a very negative view of human sexuality. We saw this even in Augustine. So the Reformation has a much more positive view of marriage and sexuality. And even more than that, the Reformers have nothing but contempt for monks and religious orders and vows of celibacy. In the Reformation, marriage shifts from being under the church's control to being under state control. And it becomes not easy, but at least more possible to get a divorce and to remarry in cases of abuse or abandonment or adultery. And suddenly there is a dramatic decrease in mysterious cases of married men dying from poisoning. An interesting note, in the Roman Catholic Church up until modern times, if you committed murder, you could go through some major serious penance and you could be forgiven and you could continue with your life. But if you divorced an abusive spouse and got remarried, well, then you live in a constant state of perpetual adultery for the rest of your days. Now, some ultra-conservative Protestants also teach this exceptionally legalistic view of marriage to this day, but that's something that many Protestants rejected. The Roman Catholic teaching that the only way to dissolve a marriage is through an annulment, that was also very problematic. The Reformers reject that because it almost always involves a lie and a deception, because annulment means that there never was any real marriage there. And of course, this is how Henry VIII got into serious trouble with the church. He had requested numerous annulments that were politically inconvenient for the Pope. It's not that the Pope cared, really, how many times Henry VIII got married. It was that one of those annulments particularly was politically inconvenient for the Pope and would have gotten him in trouble with the Holy Roman Emperor. And this results in an English Reformation that initially had everything to do with politics and very little to do with actual doctrine and change in the church. Now, this change in the theology of marriage and family also gives rise to the consistory in Geneva and other areas influenced by the Reformed and Calvin, as well as the rise in marriage and morals courts in other Protestant lands. Now, don't get the wrong idea. This is not the religious police. It is for the protection of women and children. So, for example, there is the record of a man complaining about these new Reformed pastors in the French city of Lyon because they don't even allow a man to beat his wife anymore. And you have to realize that was considered to be totally fine for a lot of people. A lot of men considered it their right to do so, to be physically abusive to their wives. Now, Luther writes a treatise on marriage in 1522, early in his career, which means it was a pretty high priority for his program of reform. And here, Luther says that human sexuality, human sexual desire, are part of God's good creation. It's part of God's design. They're not inherently sinful, as was generally believed in the early church and the medieval church and most senior high youth groups. And one result of the Reformation is that there begin to be movements toward equality for men and women in marriage. So, for example, women get the right to sue their husbands for divorce on the basis of infidelity and not just men having the right to ask for a divorce. And it also led to at least a slight shift in how people viewed gender roles. So, for example, Luther says God smiles to see a man washing diapers. And you have to understand that to be called a diaper washer in the 16th century meant that you were henpecked, you were whipped, you were not a real man. And Luther says, no, it's an honor to take that domestic role as a father. And Luther even made his wife Katharina von Bora, Katie as she's often called, the sole heir of his estate. There was a problem, however. It was illegal to make a woman your heir under Saxon law, and his will could not be enforced. In fact, she even ended up being in poverty for a while after his death, until a nobleman came and helped her out. Now, when it comes to women in ministry, even though the reformers, none of them believed that women could be regular, normal preachers, some of them thought that they could be pastors in an emergency sense, but nonetheless, their theology opened the way for later generations of women to participate more in the ministry of the church. And this happens in a number of ways. First of all, by their focus on the ministry as a prophetic office and not a priestly office. Okay, Martin Luther emphasizes the priesthood of all believers. So the pastoral office is seen primarily as a ministry of the word, not an Old Testament priest performing sacrifices at an altar. Secondly, ordination is seen not as creating some supernatural change in the person, but as the affirmation, confirmation by the church of the Spirit's gifts for preaching and pastoring that they see in an individual. It's the church's endorsement of a person's gifts for ministry. In other words, ordination is functional, not sacramental, as it is in the medieval sense. John Thompson points out that many reformers claimed that women could theoretically preach or teach in a church in an emergency situation. So Peter Martyr Formigli, a well-trained Italian Thomist who became a Protestant reformer, he makes this comment: when a church is being planted for the first time and there are no men to preach the gospel, a woman may serve at first, provided that after she has taught for a while, some man from among the faithful be ordained, who from then on will administer the sacraments, teach, and pastor faithfully. Now, this is still a rather restrictive point of view, but it is a major change from Thomas Aquinas, for example. But ultimately, the reformers could not envision women in leadership in the church or as regular pastors for two reasons. First, because of the common cultural assumptions in the Western world at that time about the nature of women. Assumptions that were a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, by the way. Women are not fit to teach, and therefore women are generally not educated. That's how the thinking goes, unless they were from the upper classes. And even then, their education was often quite limited. So women don't have the knowledge. Well, why don't they have the knowledge? Because they're not educated. Why don't you educate them? Well, because it's just not appropriate. Now, Argula von Grumsbach, whom you read, was an exception in terms of education. She was exceptionally well educated. She came from a very high class family, but the authorities ignored her and her letters because she was a woman. And others even attacked her and called her a whore in public, which is an indication of the intense misogyny of the age. And second, the Pauline statements about women being silent in 1 Corinthians 14, women being forbidden to teach in 1 Timothy 2, they were taken by the reformers to be a fairly universal prohibition, one that was based in the created order and not something that was culturally or historically relative. So it was a major biblical hurdle that the reformers could not get beyond. Today, however, there are serious exegetical arguments that challenge that traditional interpretation of those texts. For example, arguing that Paul's words to Timothy refer to a situation in Ephesus in which certain women were falling prey to false doctrine and then circulating those heresies. On the other hand, I do think that we can still thank the reformers for pointing us back to Scripture as the ultimate criterion for our doctrine and practice. And we can thank women like Argula von Grumsbach, who, nevertheless, persisted.